At Cambridge Trust, we believe that living well is about more than just managing your wealth. It's about staying informed and inspired. I'm Jennifer Klein, Executive Vice President of Wealth Management at Cambridge Trust Company, and this is the Cambridge Trust Thought Series.
My name is Jamie Kirchick, or James Kirchick. I'm a writer, author of the new book, The End of Europe, Dictators, Demagogues, and the Coming Dark Age. I'm a journalist for several publications, including the Daily Beast, for Tablet Magazine, Los Angeles Times, Foreign Policy Magazine, Commentary, Weekly Standard, Wall Street Journal. Yeah. It doesn't mean necessarily the end of the European Union. It doesn't obviously mean the end of the European landmass. It doesn't mean a catastrophic war, as we've seen in the 20th century. What it means, in my mind, is the end of Europe as we know it, as a place of relative peace and social harmony and democracy and liberal values, political stability, and the reversion to some sort of political arrangement before the integration project began after World War II, where we have basically a series of nationalist governments that are weaker, disunited than they are united, and that when it comes to their relationship with the Russians are basically involved in sort of bilateral relations. So that's how I see the end of Europe. Well, on the security situation, it has to be Russia, which has totally contravened the European security order and architecture with what it's done in Ukraine, and it's still fighting a war in Ukraine, and it has undergone a massive military spending spree. It's on the third biggest military spender in the world, and it is waging a new form of warfare, a sort of hybrid warfare. That's not necessarily the conventional kind of warfare that we're used to, which involves, hacking and leaking and disinformation on the internet and using social media networks to pollute debate and pollute public conversation and to sow confusion in Western societies. That, I would say, is the greatest threat, is Russia. The second security threat, I would say, is migratory waves that the Europeans are not prepared to handle, both in their size but also in the nature, and that these are people coming from a part of the world which is very different culturally from Europe. And I'm very skeptical that Europe can assimilate so many of these people. And we're already seeing that their presence in Europe and the social problems that are associated with it have led to a rise in political populism and far-right populism that could eventually one day break up the European Union. Well, we're already seeing in the Russian behavior in Ukraine a direct echo not only of previous Russian invasions of Hungary in 1956 or Czechoslovakia in 1968, but even what Hitler did in the Sudetenland, in the sense that the pretext that Vladimir Putin used to annex the Crimean Peninsula was the exact same pretext that Adolf Hitler used in his annexation of the Sudetenland, which is basically inventing claims of ethnic oppression being committed against your comrades or your ethnic brethren. And so just as Hitler said that the Czechs were oppressing German speakers in the Sudetenland, and therefore he had to come in and take that territory and bring it into Germany and annex it, Putin basically did the same exact thing in Crimea. So that's probably the most disturbing historical echo. I think in many of the populist movements that are rising across Europe, there are definitely echoes in not only the far right, but also the far left. The sort of populist left-wing political movements in Greece and Spain bring to mind many similarities with the communism, frankly. The attempt to whitewash history and to rewrite history in Hungary, which I discuss at length in the book, is definitely a disturbing historical echo. And the return of anti-Semitism in different guises. There's obviously the far right wing that we're all familiar with, given Europe's history, But there's a new kind, which is Islamic Islamic form of anti-Semitism, which Europe hasn't really had until recently. And then there's a left-wing anti-Semitism, which has been around since the Soviet Union was promoting it, but is becoming increasingly a problem, in particularly in Britain, where the Labour Party has basically been hijacked by a Trotskyite cabal that definitely has a problem when it comes to anti-Semitism. So those are probably the most worrying trends that I see. Well, if Europe is basically a democratic superpower like the United States, and if it's a power that we often cooperate with and that we work with, and whenever the United States wants to do something in the world, we have to go. The Europeans are our allies of first resort. If Europe becomes weaker, fractured, disunited, then that would be bad for not only the United States, it would be bad for the liberal international order that we uphold, the system of alliances and treaties and arrangements that are based on rules, that are based on respect for rights and sovereignty, that basically allow things like free trade to happen. If Europe were to collapse or if its situation were to worsen in all these respects, then a major pole in that order would be weakened, and that would, I think, you'd see powers like Russia, China, authoritarian powers that don't like this international liberal order, that want to overturn it. You will see them filling the vacuum. Well, I think as we've learned from our history, when the United States isn't involved in Europe and isn't playing a productive role in economic and political integration and in the continent's security architecture, things go pretty bad pretty quickly, and we eventually have to get involved in a way that we wouldn't have liked were we on the ground beforehand. And so I think if the United States retrenches and basically abandons its leadership role and its involvement in the continent, then I think we know from history what potentially could happen. It could be a combination of the Russians reasserting themselves. It could be a return to nationalism, security competition between European countries that hasn't existed for 75 years. None of these outcomes are very positive. I think in the Donald Trump campaign, which was explicitly nationalist, almost ethno-nationalist, and made appeals based upon racial resentment. That was something that was explicit, and that was something that sort of reminded me of European politics, where the kind of campaign that he ran that was all these things, we've seen this more in Europe than we have in the United States. So for instance, there are many similarities between Donald Trump and Marine Le Pen, the nationalist leader in France, and the United Kingdom Independence Party, which advocated for Brexit, and really just a variety of nationalist movements across Europe. They have many similarities to the Trump campaign. Well, in the short term, I would expect Marine Le Pen to lose the presidential election on Sunday. I would expect Angela Merkel to win in Germany in the fall, which could maintain the stability for the foreseeable future, for the near future. But the problems that are, the underlying problems that are affecting Europe right now are still there, and I don't see them going away in the short term. So we have sluggish growth. The economic situation is not very good. Youth unemployment is sky high in some countries like France, where it's 40%. In Spain, it's even higher. Russian aggression is not going away as long as Vladimir Putin is president. The migratory waves, they've halted for now, but if you look at the demographic situation in Africa and the Middle East, along with the potential disruptive environmental factors in that part of the world, you could see yet even larger migratory waves going into Europe. So all these conditions that lead to the problems that I describe in the book are still present, and they may be even getting worse. And so while we might see a sort of temporary respite in the kind of populist, insurgency that seems to be sweeping the globe right now, I don't see it being defeated in the now, certainly, and even in the medium to longer term. I don't see it going away. I hope it will wake Americans up and remind them of why Europe is crucial to the United States, why it should return to being our central foreign policy focus. I think we lost that after the Cold War. We just assumed Europe was settled and that things would never go wrong there ever again, and that's clearly not true. And it's also a message, I think, to Europeans to perhaps give them some advice about perhaps having an outsider and a voice from the United States who might see things differently than they do. And I hope that they'll welcome that message.
Thank you for joining us for this presentation of the Cambridge Trust Thought Series. For more Thought Series events, podcasts, articles, and videos, please visit cambridgetrust.com.